So I'm going to talk a little bit about subscription video on demand, stacking, and price sensitivity. So what's going on with the OTT market right now? So if we look at just some background statistics in terms of where the sector is on a household basis, what I'm showing now is a chart of global homes, what technologies they have. 3 lines on this. We've got pay TV in blue. So over 1 billion households worldwide now have a pay TV subscription. Free TV in yellow, and those are free satellite or free terrestrial connections, and there are about 800 million of those. And subscription video on demand. There are about 500 million households with subscription video on demand services. Now that number might look lower than some of the other figures you've seen in the past, and that's because this number is a household figure and not a subscription figure. So in other words, any one of those households may have multiple services. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in our polling data. So this data is taken from regular polling in 10 European and North American markets over the past few years, and we're interviewing thousands of consumers to understand the combinations of services that they have in their households. If we go back to Q3 2015, you can see that of all of the subscription video on demand households in the panel, about just under 70% of them had only one subscription online video service. It could be Netflix, it could be Amazon, but they have one. A relatively small proportion have 2, so about 20%, and obviously a vanishing tiny proportion have 3, 4, or 5 services. Fast forward through to the beginning of this year, and we're looking at a very different number. The minority of subscription video on demand households now have just one service. The bulk of them actually subscribe to 2 or even 3 or 4 or 5 services. So this phenomenon of stacking has obviously been one of the key drivers of growth in the OTT market. But we'll come on to perhaps a hidden trend that is impacting the market as it stands. So this chart looks at that in a different way. So it basically says, well, how many services does the typical household have? And you can see it varies across territories. You've got some markets like the Netherlands where it's quite small, 1.4. Some markets in like the US, 2.6 services. But somewhere between those bounds, 1 to 2.5 services per OTT household. But hidden in this is what looks like potentially a concerning trend. So if you take a look at the numbers slightly more closely, you can see across the 2 consecutive waves that we did of this research, so back in Q3 2018 and Q1 2019, you can see that there's perhaps a slowdown in some markets or a reversal in some others. So in Australia, the increase in the number of subscription services per OTT household was relatively small. It went from 2.03 to 2.05 services. In Italy, it went down a little bit. In Netherlands, it went down. Sweden, there's a small increase, and in the US, it went down. So what's going on here? Well, one of the factors behind this is actually the volume of services out there, although we're beginning to see some new big players enter the market. The bulk of those, we'll come on to later, are really driven by the big players, the Netflixes and the Amazons, and there haven't really been too many brand new major launches across many territories in the last year or so. So there's a bit of a slowdown there. But it's also partly the consequence of who is taking these services. So if we think about the motivations for subscribing, and we zoom in on the US specifically, we can see another factor which might be influencing the slowdown in this stacking trend. And that's this. So this represents 3 segments of the US market. Those consumers who have a pay television service, a cable or satellite service as their main TV product. So those who have an OTT service, a subscription OTT service as their main TV service. They might also supplement that with a free-to-air, free broadcast service, or even a basic cable subscription. And those who only have subscription video on demand. And what the size of the bars is telling you is how important a factor price was in their choice of TV service. And as you migrate from those traditional cable and satellite customers on the left towards those households which are focused purely or primarily on subscription online video, you can see that the price sensitivity increases. In other words, those households that are most prone to stacking, those that need to fulfill their content requirements through buying multiple services, are also the households that are perhaps most price sensitive. And when we look at some of the cord-cutting trends worldwide, you can see this very clearly in the US, that the cord-cutting rate has begun to slow a little bit. But also in this chart, you may notice that it appears to be a US-only phenomenon. So this is effectively showing net pay TV subscriber additions or losses each year. And in North America, we can see that the market's losing 3 to 4 million pay TV subscribers every year. But that's really isolated to North America at the moment. It doesn't seem to be occurring in other territories, beyond some perhaps geopolitical issues in the Middle East and in Central and South America. But Western Europe, Asia, Africa seem slightly immune to this. Now, it's not necessarily the case. The actual case is far more subtle than this. If we take a look at this chart here, we can see a clear negative impact from subscription video on demand. So let me take you through this one. Each of these dots represents a country worldwide. On the vertical axis, we've got the change in pay TV penetration, so the proportion of households that have a pay TV service, and that's change over a 2-year period from 2016 to 2018. And on the horizontal axis, we've got Netflix penetration at a fixed point in time, in the middle of that, 2017. And what this is telling us is essentially as Netflix penetration increases, pay TV growth first diminishes and then reverses into decline. Now, we don't see those in the headline numbers because for many of those markets worldwide, there are still population growth, there's still household growth. So it obscures the fact that actually in relative terms, the pay TV market is declining. So although on the surface, some of this price sensitivity looks a little bit like a US issue, we can see from some of the stacking rates that it's also the case for global markets. What does this mean? Well, as we approach a future in which more brands, Disney Plus, for instance, more D2C services hit the market, those price-sensitive customers are not the only ones potentially shifting their spend, and that those traditional pay TV subscribers become far more relevant because the content brands that they know and love are increasingly available on a direct basis. They don't have to necessarily go through a pay TV service to get hold of them. But it's not the only way of addressing some of that price sensitivity, and Hulu's a really interesting example here. If we consider what Hulu's strategy is, how it's evolved over the last few years, Hulu originally started as an ad-supported product. It launched a premium option back in 2015, and this chart shows the rise and fall of the different tiers. So in the orange there, we've got the ad-free subscribers, those taking the premium tier, and in the blue, we've got those customers who are on the ad-supported tier. Now, something slightly interesting has happened with Hulu. So it introduced the premium product back in 2015, and the orange line illustrates the growth of that ad-free customer base. So by Q2 2018, they'd reached a rough equilibrium, roughly 50% on the ad-free and 50% on the ad-supported tier. But after a record end to 2018 and a good start to early 2019, Hulu did something slightly strange, and it dropped its basic price. So why would it do that? You have a record quarter, huge numbers of new additions, people are clearly willing to pay that price. And it, of course, all boils down to the amount of money that Hulu can make from advertising relative to its premium tier. And in fact, the average ad-funded customer to Hulu is worth more than the average premium customer. So the average amount of advertising revenue an ad tier customer generates about $11 per month. So you add that to the basic tier subscription price, and it's more than the premium tier. So we can see a reverse in strategy. In fact, Hulu's pulled back from actively advertising and marketing its premium tier. And by mid-2019, the majority of customers were once again on the ad-supported plan. So it's not the only way to address price sensitivity is targeting those pay TV customers. You might consider alternative business models. So who are all these consumers taking these different services? And I guess where do all the services fit alongside one another? So if we think about the UK as a market, this is just the subscription video on demand segment, and we've bundled up some of the smaller services into one bucket. But basically, it's illustrating different combinations of services taken by different households. So this is of subscription video on demand households, what do they have? Well, the leading entry point is Netflix. It's typically the first service many consumers take, and about a third of our subscription video on demand households in the UK just take Netflix. Next in line, you have a combination, however. you add Amazon to that bundle. About 20% have both Amazon and Netflix. Then you've got Amazon and Netflix and other services, and after that, Amazon on its own. But one of the key things here is that a lot of the smaller services, whether that's ITV Hub Plus or Now TV or even some of the more niche products, are very rarely taken alone. They're normally taken as complementary to one of the big subscription OTT services like Netflix or Amazon. So they're bolt-ons in this case. But it's also not just about subscription video on demand, and people aren't just stacking subscription OTT services, they're combining them with the broadcast video on demand services. So this chart illustrates, of those internet users, what do they have? Well, the big orange circle there represents those who have access to a subscription video on demand service. The big blue circle represents those who have access or use actively one of the broadcaster video on demand services, so iPlayer or for ITV Hub and so on. And of course, as you can see from this, the majority of subscription video on demand households use a broadcaster video on demand service, and the majority of broadcaster video on demand service users also have a subscription video on demand product in their household. And this makes it quite difficult to actually tell these customers apart. So this is the demographic breakdown in terms of age of the different services in Q1 2019 in terms of their monthly user bases. And we can see some slight differences, that Netflix, Amazon, Now TV skew slightly younger. They've got slightly more in that 18 to 24 bracket and that 25 to 34 bracket. All four looks a little bit more like those subscription services, and BBC iPlayer and ITV Hub skew a little bit older. But fundamentally, they're not massively different. Some of them have got slightly more younger users, some of them slightly more older users. But the demographic composition isn't fundamentally different across any of them. But it certainly isn't fair to say that all of the users of each of those services, while they may resemble one another from a demographic perspective, they don't necessarily want the same thing. And if we can take an example, a case study here, I'm going to pick Disney+. So we've just conducted a study in the US looking at potential Disney+ users. And you might be forgiven for thinking, well, okay, Disney, it's got Marvel, it's got some of the Disney animated movies, what else? It's got Star Wars, and it's got a few other brands. So it's really targeting a younger age bracket. And that's true. But within that, there are two very distinct audiences. So this chart on the left here illustrates those people who are likely or highly likely to consider subscribing to Disney+ later this year when it launches. And the two groups that are most prominent here are those who are in the 18 to 24-year-old bracket and those who have children in the household. But they're two entirely distinct categories of consumers. They don't overlap, and to some extent that's not surprising. If you're 18 to 24, maybe you're still at university, maybe you've just finished, you're starting your career, you haven't got a family yet. And likewise, if you've got children in the household, you're probably slightly older. But it's not just the demographics that separate these, it's their content preferences. And if you look at what the 18 to 24-year-olds want, they want the Marvel titles. That's what they're after with Disney+. Those with children in the household want something else. They want the animated titles primarily. And everyone else, the 40% of people who don't fall into this bracket, well, they've got a whole mishmash of needs. So some of them want Star Wars, some of them want the Disney TV shows, some of them want National Geographic. So even for this one service, which on the surface might look like it's got a very narrow target, has a whole range of content requirements driving potential subscribers. So where does this leave us? Well, if I'm honest, with a bit of a mess. We've got so many services in the market right now, all fulfilling slightly different needs for slightly different consumers. Arguably, you've got a few different strategies evolving. So you've got active curation of catalogues, channel-like approach at the bottom, and you've got aggregation at the top, a platform-like approach. And that's perhaps typified already by Amazon channels, but maybe Apple launching later in the year or next year will act as an aggregator or a platform in this case. And it's these services, I think, that we'll probably want to pay the most attention to over the next few years, because these have two purposes. One of those is that they offer a route to market to those secondary brands, those brands that can't necessarily stand alone in the subscription video on demand market. If you're a mid-tier thematic brand, a documentary or a secondary run TV channel, then it might be difficult to persuade people to pay $4, $5, $6.99 per month for your service. but aggregated up and sold with other services, well, maybe you could convince a few more people. And that has a secondary effect because it encourages more of those brands to move into the direct-to-consumer market. And those pay TV customers who we looked at earlier, those less price-sensitive customers, those people who are actually willing to pay a larger amount, may then be moving more aggressively into the stacking market. So while we may have seen a temporary lull in that stacking behaviour from consumers, I don't think we've seen the last of it. Thank you very much.
Told you it was good. Right, any questions? No? One question, John, at the front. You might just shout, John.
When do you think we'll see the sort of less price-sensitive people start moving over seriously? Is that when Disney comes in or sooner?
Okay, so the question was, in case you didn't hear it at the back, when are we going to see the more price-sensitive consumers coming over to SVOD?
So
Less price, sorry.
It's going to depend when the services launch in the market. So we'll need to see aggregation models more crystallise, I think. So at the moment, we've got a few approaches. We've got Amazon's approach, which is very much like an a la carte system that you pick and choose. And if there's anything that the traditional pay TV market has shown, it's that a la carte models don't work particularly well. They look great. People say, yes, I want to pick which content I want. But actually, for those customers in the pay TV category, they want a simple, big bill that they pay each month. They don't have to worry about picking and choosing the channels. So I suspect we'll see some movement in the aggregation model, some experimentation with a la carte and package and bundle models. And I think that's going to take a couple of years before services really begin to find their feet on that. So not for a couple of years yet.
It's common in the Far East, isn't it? You have a subscription, you gain points, and you can pick and choose which services you take, both pay TV channels and also SVOD platforms. And it's happening in Sweden, isn't it, as well, with Comhem has got a service which I'm going to mispronounce. I think it's something like Blandselv, which basically you pay a subscription, and depending on the subscription, you get a certain number of points, and you can pick and choose what you want. And it goes across, as I said, channels, linear channels, and platforms as well.
Yeah, well, certainly there are a few different models I think they'll be looking at. It wouldn't surprise me if we see a big return to the simple package structure in certain markets like the UK or US, though.
Okay, so any more questions? Okay, I've got a question for Richard. So, Richard, do you think the US market's overcrowded?
In terms of... I think we will see some fallout in the market, so I don't think all the services currently present there will survive. I think that's fair to say. But equally, I think there's still room for some premium services at the high end. One of the mistakes I think we often see in the subscription OTT sector, and maybe we'll hear about this in a minute, I don't know, is that companies go into the market with too poor a content offer. You know, the title count is too low, the refresh rate's too low, and I don't think they'll survive. But equally, we've barely seen the studio moves into the OTT sector yet, so I think they will be competing for an increasing share of wallet. And given the typical spend from US cable customers of $90 per month, you know, there's still plenty of room there that can be cannibalised with new OTT entrants.
Okay, so how many subscriptions per SVOD subscriber do you think the US market will plateau out? Approximately. About. Is it going to be 5 or 6 or 4?
I mean, it could be more. So if you look at the typical price points that US consumers are willing to pay, they might be willing to pay $90 per month. So on average, that would support a dozen different subscription video on demand services. Now, I don't think people are going to be independently subscribing to a dozen different OTT services, but what I suspect they'll do is they'll pick a couple of the big ones and an aggregator who will bill them for another dozen or so different services. So that would be my guess as to the top end of the market.
Interesting. And I suppose you could argue, compared with the US market, the UK market's fairly immature, fairly underserved as far as platforms are concerned.
Yeah, certainly there are fewer services in the UK from a subscription-only standpoint. I guess the difference is the broadcaster platforms, and they're much stronger than in the US. So BVOD isn't really a thing in the US, and I think that does impact both willingness to pay and competition for viewing time. And that may mean that longer term our stacking behaviour is considerably reduced compared to the US.
Brilliant. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much,
Thank you
Richard.
very much.
Please
Pleasure.
give a hand to Richard again. Thank you very much. Very interesting.